The November rain drummed steadily against the windows of the cramped studio apartment in Southside Chicago, where 58-year-old Raymond Ray Williams sat at his small kitchen table, staring at a text message that had arrived 3 hours earlier. The message was from his daughter Keisha, and it contained an invitation that felt more like an obligation than a gesture of love. "Dad, you can come to Thanksgiving dinner tomorrow at 3 p.m. Don't bring anything, just come." Ray read the message for the 10th time, searching for warmth that wasn't there, for enthusiasm that was conspicuously absent. After 2 years of strained relationships and increasingly distant interactions with his 3 adult children, this invitation felt like charity rather than family connection. At 58, Ray carried the weathered hands and stooped shoulders of a man who had spent 35 years working double shifts at the Ford assembly plant in Dearborn, building cars that he could never afford to buy. The layoffs had come 2 years ago when the plant downsized, and despite his decades of experience and perfect attendance record, Ray had been among the first to go. At his age, finding new employment had proven nearly impossible, and his savings had dwindled to almost nothing while he struggled to maintain his dignity and independence. The studio apartment he now called home was a far cry from the modest 3-bedroom house in Roseland, where he had raised Keisha, Marcus, and Tiana as a single father after their mother died of cancer when the children were still young. That house had been foreclosed on 18 months ago, forcing Ray into this tiny space with its thin walls, flickering fluorescent lights, and the persistent smell of his neighbor's cooking that reminded him daily of how far he had fallen. Ray's phone buzzed with another message, this one from his youngest daughter, Tiana. "Dad, Keisha told me she invited you to dinner tomorrow. Please try to be pleasant. Her in-laws will be there, and she's been stressed about making a good impression." The implication stung. Ray was being warned to behave himself, to not embarrass his daughter in front of her husband's family. The man who had worked himself into exhaustion to put all 3 children through college was now seen as a potential source of shame rather than pride. Ray stood up from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the grey November afternoon. The neighborhood around his apartment building was rough. Not dangerous exactly, but worn down by decades of economic decline and neglect. He watched a group of teenagers hurrying past in the rain, their laughter echoing off the wet pavement, and he remembered walking these same streets with his children 20 years ago, when this area had been their home, when being poor hadn't meant being worthless. The children had all moved away as soon as they were able. Keisha, now 34, was a nurse manager at Northwestern Memorial Hospital, married to a successful accountant named Derek, living in a beautiful suburb north of the city. Marcus, 32, worked in IT for a financial firm and lived in a downtown loft that cost more per month than Ray had ever made in 2 months. Tiana, the baby at 29, was a social worker who had moved to Milwaukee and visited Chicago only for major holidays. All 3 had achieved the success that Ray had dreamed of for them, the middle-class stability that he had sacrificed everything to make possible. But their success had created distance rather than gratitude, embarrassment rather than appreciation for the sacrifices that had made their achievements possible. Ray's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed Marcus's name. "Hey, Dad," Marcus said, his voice carrying the careful professional tone he used with clients. "Keisha told me you're coming to dinner tomorrow." "That's the plan," Ray replied, trying to keep his own voice neutral. "Listen, Dad, I wanted to give you a heads up. Derek's parents are going to be there. Dr. and Mrs. Hamilton, they're pretty traditional, conservative, maybe just, keep the political talk to a minimum." Ray felt his jaw clench. His political talk consisted mainly of supporting workers' rights and expressing concern about the growing inequality he saw around him every day. These weren't radical positions. They were the lived experiences of a man who had watched good jobs disappear and working families struggle to survive. Marcus, when have I ever been inappropriate at a family gathering? You haven't, Dad. I'm just saying that Derek's family is different from us. They have different perspectives on things. The words "different from us" hung in the air. Marcus was distancing himself from his father's reality, aligning himself with his sister's in-laws rather than his own family history. I understand, Ray said quietly. Great. And Dad, maybe wear the blue suit if you still have it, the one we got you for Keisha's wedding. After Marcus hung up, Ray sat back down at his kitchen table and stared at the invitation text again. He was being invited to Thanksgiving dinner with conditions. Don't bring anything, don't talk politics, dress appropriately, don't embarrass the family. He was being allowed to attend his own daughter's holiday celebration like a guest who might be turned away if he didn't follow the rules. Ray walked to his small closet and found the blue suit Marcus had mentioned. It was a good suit, purchased 3 years ago when Ray still had steady employment and hope for the future. The jacket fit a little loose now. He'd lost weight since the layoffs, not from any intentional diet, but from the stress and the careful budgeting that sometimes meant choosing between groceries and utilities. As evening fell, Ray tried to watch television, but his mind kept returning to Thanksgiving dinners of the past. He remembered the years when his children were young, when their modest dining room table had been crowded with extended family and neighbors who had nowhere else to go. Ray had always insisted that anyone who needed a meal was welcome at their table, and those gatherings had been filled with laughter, stories, and the kind of warmth that money couldn't buy. He remembered teaching Keisha how to make cornbread dressing when she was 12, showing Marcus how to carve the turkey when he turned 16, letting Tiana help with the sweet potato pie, even though her help usually meant more mess than assistance. Those had been the best days of his life, not because they had much, but because they had each other. Now his children saw him as an obligation rather than an asset, a burden rather than the foundation of their success. They had achieved everything he had wanted for them, but somewhere along the way, they had learned to be ashamed of where they came from. Ray's neighbor, Mrs. Washington, knocked on his door around 8 o'clock. She was a woman in her 70s who lived alone in the apartment next door and often checked on Ray with the kind of maternal concern that reminded him how isolated he had become. "Ray, honey, you got any plans for tomorrow?" she asked when he opened the door. "Having dinner with my daughter Keisha and her family," Ray replied. Mrs. Washington studied his face with the perceptive gaze of someone who had raised 6 children and buried a husband. "You don't sound too excited about it." Ray hesitated, then decided to be honest. "It feels more like an obligation than a celebration. I think they see me as, I don't know, as someone they have to take care of rather than someone they want to spend time with." Mrs. Washington shook her head sadly. "Ray, I've been watching you for 2 years now, and I've seen how hard you've tried to maintain your dignity while everything fell apart around you. Your children should be proud of you, not ashamed of you." "They're not ashamed exactly. They've moved on to bigger and better things. Baby, there ain't nothing bigger or better than family, and there ain't nothing more important than remembering where you came from and who helped you get where you are." After Mrs. Washington left, Ray lay in bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to decide whether to go to Thanksgiving dinner at all. Part of him wanted to stay home, to avoid the careful conversations and the feeling of being judged by people who didn't know his story. But another part of him desperately wanted to see his children, to be part of their lives, to feel like he still mattered to the people he loved most in the world. Ray fell asleep that night with a mixture of anticipation and dread, unaware that the next day would force him to confront the painful reality of how his children truly saw him, and would require him to make a choice between his dignity and his desperate desire to remain connected to his family. The last thing he remembered before drifting off was the sound of rain against his window and the echo of Mrs. Washington's words, "There ain't nothing more important than remembering where you came from and who helped you get where you are." Tomorrow he would discover whether his children remembered those lessons or whether their success had erased their memory of the man who had made it all possible. Thanksgiving morning dawned gray and cold in Chicago, with a sharp wind off Lake Michigan that cut through Ray's thin coat as he waited for the bus that would take him to Keisha's house in Evanston. He had spent an hour getting ready, showering in the cramped bathroom of his studio apartment, carefully pressing his blue suit and polishing the dress shoes that were showing their age but still maintained a dignified appearance. The bus ride took 45 minutes, carrying Ray through neighborhoods that grew progressively more affluent as they moved away from the South Side. He watched the scenery change from boarded-up storefronts and chain-link fences to tree-lined streets with well-maintained homes and manicured lawns. This journey felt like traveling through different worlds, from the reality of his current life to the success his children had achieved. Keisha's house was a beautiful colonial in a neighborhood of young professionals and established families. Ray had been there only twice before, once for a brief visit when Keisha and Derek first bought the house, and once for their wedding reception 3 years ago. Both visits had felt formal and awkward, as if Ray were a guest rather than family. Ray stood on the front porch for a moment, gathering his courage before ringing the doorbell. He could hear voices and laughter from inside, the sounds of a family celebration already in progress. Through the front window, he glimpsed people moving around in what appeared to be an elegant dining room, and he felt a familiar nervousness about fitting into this world his daughter had created. Derek answered the door, looking polished and welcoming in the way that successful people often appeared when performing hospitality. He was a tall, light-skinned black man with the kind of confidence that came from never having worried about money, never having worked with his hands, never having struggled to keep a roof over his children's heads. "Ray, good to see you," Derek said, extending his hand for a firm shake. "Come on in, we're just about to start dinner." Ray stepped into the foyer and was immediately struck by the elegance of his daughter's home. Hardwood floors gleamed under expensive light fixtures, and the walls were decorated with professional photography and carefully chosen artwork. Everything spoke of taste, education, and financial success. "Dad!" Keisha appeared from the kitchen, wearing an apron over an expensive-looking dress. She hugged him briefly, and Ray noticed that she smelled like the expensive perfume he used to save up to buy her for Christmas when she was in college. "You look beautiful, baby girl," Ray said, and meant it. Keisha had inherited her mother's elegant features and had clearly invested in maintaining her appearance in ways that reflected her professional success. "Thank you, Dad. Come meet Derek's parents. They've been looking forward to meeting you." Ray followed Keisha into the living room, where he was introduced to Dr. and Mrs. Hamilton, an older couple who radiated the kind of understated wealth that came from generations of professional success. Dr. Hamilton was a retired surgeon, and his wife had been a college professor. They greeted Ray with polite courtesy, but he could see them taking in his appearance, his obvious discomfort, and probably calculating his place in their son's family hierarchy. Marcus and Tiana were already there, both looking prosperous and comfortable in their success. Marcus wore a cashmere sweater that probably cost more than Ray spent on groceries in 2 months, and Tiana was dressed in the kind of stylish outfit that suggested she was doing well in her social work career in Milwaukee. "Dad, you made it," Marcus said, embracing his father with what felt like genuine warmth. "How was the trip?" "Fine, son. The bus was on time." Ray noticed a quick glance exchanged between Marcus and Keisha when he mentioned taking the bus. It was a reminder of his current circumstances. his lack of a car, his dependence on public transportation in a family that had moved beyond such concerns. The conversation before dinner was polite but stilted, with Ray feeling like an observer rather than a participant. Dr. and Mrs. Hamilton talked about their recent cruise to the Mediterranean. Derek discussed his accounting firm's expansion plans, and Marcus shared news about a promotion he was expecting at his IT company. When they moved to the dining room, Ray was struck by the elegance of the table setting. Fine china, crystal glasses, silver serving pieces, all the markers of the middle-class success that Keisha had achieved. Ray remembered the Thanksgiving dinners of his children's youth, when they had eaten off mismatched plates and used paper napkins, but the table had been full of love and laughter. Ray was seated between Tiana and Mrs. Hamilton, clearly positioned as an honored guest, but somehow feeling more isolated than included. As they began eating the beautifully prepared meal, the conversation flowed around topics that Ray couldn't contribute to: vacation plans, investment strategies, home renovations, private school options for Derek and Keisha's future children. "Ray," Dr. Hamilton said during a lull in the conversation, "Derek tells me you worked in manufacturing. That must have been interesting work." The way Dr. Hamilton said manufacturing made it sound quaint and outdated, a relic from an earlier era rather than the honest labor that had built the American middle class. "I worked at the Ford plant for 35 years, Ray replied. "Built cars, raised my children, took care of my family." "That's admirable," Mrs. Hamilton said with the kind of polite condescension that wealthy people often showed toward working-class accomplishments. "It must have been quite an adjustment when the plant closed." Ray felt the weight of their curiosity and judgment. "It was challenging, but I'm managing." "Dad's been looking for work," Keisha interjected quickly, as if his unemployment were a temporary embarrassment, rather than a reflection of the economic realities facing older workers in a changing economy. "The job market is tough these days," Derek said with false sympathy, "but I'm sure something will turn up." Ray nodded and continued eating, feeling like a charity case at his own daughter's table. The conversation moved on to other topics, and Ray found himself increasingly invisible, his presence acknowledged but not particularly valued. The breaking point came during dessert, when Dr. Hamilton began discussing the importance of financial planning and personal responsibility in achieving success. "I've always believed that people's circumstances are largely the result of their choices, Doctor," Hamilton said, apparently warming to a favorite topic. "Hard work and smart decisions lead to prosperity, while poor choices lead to struggle." Ray felt his jaw clench. This was the kind of oversimplified thinking that ignored structural inequality, job market realities, and the way economic forces beyond individual control could destroy even the most responsible and hard-working people. "Sometimes hard work isn't enough," Ray said quietly. "Sometimes good people get hit by circumstances beyond their control." The table fell silent, and Ray could feel every eye turning toward him. "Well, of course there are exceptions," Dr. Hamilton said, with the patient tone of someone explaining something to a child. "But generally speaking, success comes to those who earn it." "Dad," Keisha said in a warning tone, "maybe we should talk about something else." But Ray couldn't let it go. 35 years of hard work, of sacrifice, of doing everything right and still losing everything. He couldn't sit silently while someone dismissed his reality as a personal failure. "Dr. Hamilton, I worked every day for 35 years. I never missed work unless one of my children was sick. I saved money. I bought a house. I put 3 kids through college. I did everything you're supposed to do, and I still lost everything when the economy changed and my job disappeared." The silence at the table was deafening. Keisha was staring at her plate, Marcus looked uncomfortable, and Tiana was fidgeting with her napkin. "Dad, please," Keisha said, her voice tight with embarrassment. No, baby girl, I need to say this. Your success, all of your success, was built on the foundation of my work. I may not have a fancy education or a professional job, but I earned my place at this table by raising you and supporting you and loving you. Dr. Hamilton cleared his throat. Ray, I didn't mean to suggest— Yes, you did, Ray interrupted, his voice growing stronger. You meant exactly what you said. You think poor people deserve to be poor, and successful people deserve their success, and there's no connection between privilege and opportunity. Dad, that's enough, Marcus said firmly. You're being disrespectful to Keisha's guests. I'm being honest, Ray replied. Something this family used to value. Keisha stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Dad, I need to talk to you in the kitchen. Now. Ray followed his daughter into the elegant kitchen, where she turned to face him with an expression of fury and disappointment. How could you do this to me? Keisha hissed, keeping her voice low so the guests wouldn't hear. How could you embarrass me like this in front of Derek's parents? I wasn't trying to embarrass you, Keisha. I was trying to defend myself against their judgment. Their judgment? Dad, they were being polite. They were trying to include you in the conversation. They were being condescending, and you know it. Keisha's voice rose slightly. You know what, Dad? Maybe they have a point. Maybe your situation is the result of your choices. Maybe if you had been more ambitious, more forward-thinking, more willing to adapt, you wouldn't be living in that horrible apartment and depending on us to take care of you. The words hit Ray like physical blows. His own daughter, the child he had sacrificed everything to raise, was echoing Dr. Hamilton's cruel assessment of his circumstances. Keisha, how can you say that? You know how hard I worked, how much I sacrificed for you and your brother and sister. And I'm grateful for that, Dad. But gratitude doesn't mean I have to pretend that your life turned out the way it should have. It doesn't mean I have to make excuses for your failures. Ray stared at his daughter, seeing a stranger where he had expected love and understanding. My failures? Yes, Dad, your failures. You're 58 years old with no savings, no prospects, no plan for the future. You're living in a studio apartment in a bad neighborhood, and you can't even afford a car to get to family dinner. That's not just bad luck. That's the result of choices. Ray felt something break inside his chest. Keisha, I spent every penny I had making sure you could go to nursing school. I worked double shifts so you could focus on your studies instead of working. I mortgaged my house to pay for your wedding. And I appreciate that, Dad, but that was your job as a parent. That doesn't give you the right to embarrass me in front of my in-laws or to make me responsible for taking care of you for the rest of your life. The kitchen fell silent, except for the sound of Ray's breathing and the distant murmur of conversation from the dining room. Ray looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and saw someone who had forgotten where she came from, who had internalized the values of people who measured worth by bank account balances and job titles. So what are you saying, Keisha? Keisha took a deep breath, and Ray could see her gathering the courage to say something that would change their relationship forever. I'm saying that I can't keep doing this, Dad. I can't keep inviting you to family events where you make everyone uncomfortable. I can't keep worrying about whether you're going to say something inappropriate or political or embarrassing. She paused, and Ray could see tears forming in her eyes, but her voice remained steady. I'm saying that maybe you need to focus on getting your own life together before you try to be part of ours. And honestly, Dad, right now, you're nothing but an extra mouth to feed and a source of stress that I don't need in my life. The words hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Ray felt as if he had been slapped, as if the breath had been knocked out of his lungs. His own daughter, the child he had raised with love and sacrifice, had just told him that he was nothing but a burden. Ray looked at Keisha for a long moment, memorizing her face, trying to find some trace of the little girl who used to crawl into his lap and tell him about her dreams of becoming a nurse so she could help people. "I see," he said quietly. "Dad, I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did," Ray interrupted, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "You meant exactly what you said, just like Dr. Hamilton meant what he said." Ray walked past his daughter toward the front door, pausing only to collect his coat from the hall closet. "Dad, where are you going?" Keisha called after him. "I'm leaving," Ray said without turning around. "Apparently I'm an extra mouth to feed, and I wouldn't want to be a burden on your family dinner." Ray opened the front door and stepped out into the cold November afternoon, leaving behind the warmth and elegance of his daughter's house, but also leaving behind any illusion he'd had about his place in his children's lives. As he walked toward the bus stop, Ray could hear the front door open behind him and Keisha's voice calling his name, but he didn't turn around. Some words, once spoken, couldn't be taken back. Some wounds, once inflicted, couldn't be healed with apologies. Ray had learned the hard truth about his relationship with his children. Their love was conditional, based on his ability to fit into their new lives rather than on recognition of the sacrifices he had made to give them those lives. He was welcome in their world, only as long as he didn't remind them where they had come from or ask them to acknowledge the cost of their success. The bus ride home took 45 minutes, but it felt like a journey of years, carrying Ray from the last remnants of hope for his family relationships to the stark reality of his isolation. He was no longer a father whose children were grateful for his sacrifices. He was an embarrassment they tolerated out of obligation and would discard as soon as it became socially acceptable to do so. Ray spent the weekend after Thanksgiving in his small apartment, alternating between numbness and waves of pain that felt like physical illness. He replayed Keisha's words over and over in his mind. "You're nothing but an extra mouth to feed and a source of stress that I don't need in my life." Each repetition felt like reopening a wound that couldn't heal. Mrs. Washington knocked on his door Friday evening, carrying a plate of leftover turkey and dressing from her own modest Thanksgiving celebration. "Ray, honey, you've been too quiet over there," she said when he opened the door. "How was dinner with your daughter?" Ray looked at the kind concern in her eyes and felt his composure crack. "It didn't go well, Mrs. Washington." She studied his face, then pushed past him into the apartment. "Sit down and tell me what happened." For the next hour, Ray found himself describing the entire painful experience. The condescending comments from Derek's parents, his attempt to defend his dignity, and finally, Keisha's devastating words in the kitchen. Mrs. Washington listened without interruption, occasionally shaking her head or making soft sounds of sympathy. "Ray, that child has forgotten who she is and where she came from," Mrs. Washington said when he finished. "Success can do that to people if they're not careful. It can make them think they're better than the people who raised them." "Maybe she's right, though," Ray said quietly. "Maybe I'm just a burden. Maybe I have failed." Mrs. Washington stood up with the kind of righteous anger that only a woman who had raised 6 children could muster. "Ray Williams, don't you dare let that ungrateful child make you question your worth. You raised 3 successful children as a single father while working your behind off at that plant. You sacrificed everything so they could have better lives, and now they want to act like your love and sacrifice don't matter because you hit some hard times." She sat back down and took Ray's hands in hers. "Baby, your worth isn't measured by your bank account or your job title. Your worth is measured by the love you gave, the sacrifices you made, and the character you showed when life got hard. But maybe Keisha has a point about my choices. Maybe if I had been smarter with money or gone back to school or—" "Ray, stop right there. You made the best choices you could with the information and resources you had at the time. You worked an honest job, you raised good children, and you built a life based on love and sacrifice. The economy changed, your job disappeared, and you lost everything through no fault of your own. Mrs. Washington's voice grew stronger. Your children succeeded because of your foundation, not in spite of it. They owe their education, their opportunities, and their character to the man who worked double shifts so they could pursue their dreams. The fact that they can't see that anymore is their failing, not yours. On Monday morning, Ray received a phone call from Marcus. Dad, Keisha told me what happened on Thanksgiving. She's really upset about the whole thing. She's upset. Ray felt a flash of anger. Marcus, your sister told me I was nothing but an extra mouth to feed. She kicked me out of her house after I defended myself against her in-laws' condescending comments about poor people. Dad, I know she said some harsh things, but you have to understand the pressure she's under. Derek's parents are very traditional, and they have certain expectations about family dynamics. Ray felt a familiar disappointment settling over him. Marcus was choosing sides and he wasn't choosing his father. So you agree with her? Marcus was quiet for a moment. Dad, I think maybe you could have handled the situation differently. Getting into political arguments at Thanksgiving dinner isn't really appropriate. Political arguments? Marcus, I was defending my dignity as a working man against people who think poverty is a moral failing. But Dad, you have to understand how it looked. Derek's parents are successful, educated people, and you were essentially attacking their worldview. Their worldview is that people like me deserve to be poor. Yeah, that's not what they meant, and you know it. Ray realized that Marcus had internalized the same attitudes that had infected Keisha. His children had learned to see the world through the eyes of their social and economic superiors, and from that perspective, their father's struggles were indeed a source of embarrassment. Marcus, do you remember when you were 12 and you wanted to quit school to get a job because some kids were making fun of your shoes? Dad, what does that have to do with... Do you remember what I told you? I said that your worth wasn't determined by what other people thought of your shoes, and that education was the one thing nobody could ever take away from you. I worked 16-hour days that summer to buy you new shoes and school clothes because I wanted you to have pride in yourself. Marcus was quiet. Now you're telling me that I should have stayed quiet while successful people dismissed my life's work as personal failure because their opinion matters more than my dignity. Dad, it's not that simple. Yes, it is that simple, Marcus. Either you believe that I deserve respect as your father and as a man who worked hard to raise you, or you believe that my current circumstances make me an embarrassment to be tolerated rather than a father to be honored. The conversation ended without resolution, leaving Ray with the growing realization that all three of his children had fundamentally changed their view of him. He was no longer their father. He was their poor relation, an inconvenient reminder of their humble origins. Tuesday afternoon brought an unexpected visit from Tiana, who appeared at Ray's door looking uncomfortable and apologetic. Dad, can I come in? I wanted to talk about what happened on Thursday. Ray let her into his small apartment, noting how she tried to hide her reaction to his modest living conditions. Dad, I want you to know that I don't agree with how Keisha handled things. She shouldn't have said what she said. Ray felt a flicker of hope. I appreciate that, baby girl. But Dad, I also think you need to understand where she's coming from. Keisha has worked really hard to build her life, and she's under a lot of pressure to maintain her position in Derek's family and social circle. The hope died quickly. So you're saying I should have accepted their disrespect to make her life easier? Tiana shifted uncomfortably. I'm saying that maybe there were better ways to handle the situation. Maybe you could have changed the subject, or found common ground, or I could have smiled and nodded while they explained that poor people deserve to be poor. Dad, you're being dramatic. They weren't attacking you personally. Ray looked at his youngest daughter, the child he had been closest to, the one who had always been most sensitive to others' feelings. Even she had learned to prioritize social comfort over truth, diplomacy over dignity. Tiana, when you were in graduate school studying social work, what did they teach you about systemic inequality and structural barriers to economic mobility? Dad, that's different. That's academic theory. No, baby girl, that's my life. That's the reality of working-class people in America. And when Dr. Hamilton dismissed that reality as personal failure, he was attacking not just me, but every person who's ever lost a job to downsizing, every parent who's ever worked multiple jobs to keep their family afloat, every American who's ever discovered that hard work isn't always enough. Tiana was quiet for a moment. Dad, I understand your perspective, but you have to understand that not everyone sees things the way you do. Ma'am, what way is that? You tend to see everything through the lens of class conflict. Not every interaction is about rich people versus poor people. Ray felt something die inside him. His daughter, who worked with disadvantaged families for a living, was telling him that his lived experience of economic inequality was just a biased perspective rather than observable reality. Tiana, I want you to leave now. Dad, I didn't come here to fight with you. I came to try to find a way to work this out. Work what out? The fact that all three of my children are ashamed of me? The fact that my own family sees me as a burden and an embarrassment? That's not true, Dad. Yes, it is. You just spent 10 minutes explaining why I should have accepted disrespect to avoid making Keisha uncomfortable. You've prioritized her social anxieties over my dignity, just like Marcus prioritized Derek's parents' comfort over my right to defend myself. Tiana stood up to leave, and Ray could see tears in her eyes. Dad, I love you. We all love you. But love doesn't mean we have to agree with everything you do or say. No, baby girl, it doesn't. But love does mean that you stand by your family when outsiders attack them. Love means that you defend the person who sacrificed everything for you when people dismiss their struggles as personal failure. After Tiana left, Ray sat in his small apartment and confronted the full scope of his isolation. His children loved him in the abstract, but they were embarrassed by the concrete reality of his life. They appreciated his sacrifices in theory, but they resented the way his current circumstances reflected poorly on their social status. Ray had raised his children to be successful, but he had failed to teach them to be loyal. He had given them opportunities, but he hadn't given them the character to honor the source of those opportunities when it became socially inconvenient. That evening, Ray made a decision that would have seemed impossible a week earlier. He wrote 3 letters, one to each of his children, explaining that he would no longer attend family gatherings or accept invitations that came with conditions about his behavior or appearance. I raised you to be successful, he wrote, but I also tried to raise you to be decent human beings who understood the difference between worth and wealth. If you cannot see me as a father deserving of respect rather than a burden to be managed, then it's better for all of us if I step back from your lives until you can remember who you are and where you came from. Ray sealed the letters and mailed them the next morning, then settled into his small apartment to build a life that didn't depend on the approval or acceptance of children who had forgotten the value of the man who raised them. For the first time in months, Ray felt something approaching peace. He had chosen dignity over desperation, self-respect over the conditional love of children who saw him as an embarrassment rather than the foundation of their success. Mrs. Washington was right. His worth wasn't measured by his bank account or his social status. His worth was measured by the sacrifices he had made, the love he had given, and the character he maintained even when the people he loved most couldn't see past his current circumstances to the man who had made their lives possible. Ray Williams was poor, but he was not worthless. He was unemployed, but he was not without value. He was alone, but he was not defeated. And for the first time since losing his job, Ray began to imagine a future that didn't depend on the approval of people who had forgotten what really mattered in life. 6 months after Ray mailed the letters to his children, he sat in the community room of the Southside Community Center, leading his 3rd session of a support group for displaced workers over 50. The group had started with just Ray and 2 other men who had lost manufacturing jobs, but word had spread, and they now had 12 regular members who met every Tuesday evening to share experiences, job search strategies, and emotional support. "The hardest part isn't the unemployment," said James, a former steelworker who had been out of work for 18 months. "It's the way people look at you differently, like you're somehow less than what you were when you had a steady paycheck." Ray nodded with understanding. "James, that's exactly why this group exists. Society wants to define us by our current circumstances instead of our lifetime of contributions, but we know better." The group had become Ray's lifeline, a place where his experience and wisdom were valued rather than dismissed. Through word of mouth, he had also started helping other displaced workers navigate the complicated process of applying for unemployment benefits, accessing job retraining programs, and maintaining their dignity during the dehumanizing process of long-term job searching. "Ray," said Maria, one of the newer members who had lost her job at a textile factory, "I wanted to thank you for helping me with my resume last week. I got called for an interview at the hospital for a custodial position." That's wonderful, Maria. You have 20 years of experience keeping a workplace clean and safe. Any employer would be lucky to have you." After the group meeting ended, Ray walked home through the familiar streets of his neighborhood, feeling a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced in years. He might not have the financial security or family connection he once had, but he was building something meaningful with people who understood his struggles and valued his contributions. Ray's small apartment had become more than just a place to sleep. It was now an informal headquarters for his advocacy work, with filing cabinets full of resources for displaced workers, a desk where he helped people fill out job applications, and walls covered with thank you notes from people he had helped navigate the system. Mrs. Washington knocked on his door as he was preparing dinner, carrying a plate of cornbread and wearing the satisfied expression of someone with good news to share. "Ray, honey, you need to sit down. I've got something to tell you." Ray accepted the cornbread and gestured for her to take a seat at his small kitchen table. "What's got you so excited, Mrs. Washington?" "I was at the grocery store today, and I ran into a young woman who works at Channel 7 News, Cheryl something. She was asking about you." Ray looked puzzled. "About me? Why would a news reporter be asking about me?" "Apparently, someone told her about the work you've been doing with displaced workers, and she wants to do a story about it. She left her card and asked me to have you call her." Ray took the business card Mrs. Washington handed him, studying the name, Cheryl Rodriguez, investigative reporter, WLS-TV Channel 7. "I can't imagine why anyone would want to do a news story about what I'm doing." "Ray, you've helped over 50 people in the past 6 months. You've connected them with resources, helped them maintain their dignity, and created a community where people support each other instead of feeling ashamed of their circumstances. That's newsworthy." The next morning, Ray called Cheryl Rodriguez, expecting a brief conversation that would lead nowhere. Instead, He found himself talking to an enthusiastic journalist who had been researching the challenges facing displaced older workers and was looking for positive stories about community response to the crisis. "Mr. Williams, I've been hearing about your work from social service agencies, community leaders, and the people you've helped. Would you be willing to meet with me to discuss a possible feature story?" 2 days later, Cheryl Rodriguez arrived at the Southside Community Center with a camera crew, ready to document Ray's support group and interview some of the people he had helped. Ray was nervous about the attention, but the group members encouraged him to share their story with a wider audience. "Mr. Williams," Cheryl said as they prepared for the interview, "can you tell me how you started this support group?" Ray thought about the question, remembering the dark months after his Thanksgiving confrontation with his children, when he had felt worthless and forgotten. "I started the group because I realized that when you lose your job after 50, you don't just lose your income. You lose your identity, your sense of purpose, your place in society. And too often, you lose the respect of people who should know better." "What do you mean by that?" Ray hesitated, then decided to be honest. "I mean that even our own families sometimes start to see us as failures rather than people who got hit by forces beyond our control. When that happens, we need to create our own community of people who understand that a man's worth isn't measured by his current employment status." The interview continued for an hour, with Ray explaining the practical help the group provided, the emotional support they offered each other, and the way they worked to maintain dignity in a society that often discarded older workers. "Mr. Williams, what would you say to families who might not understand what their unemployed relatives are going through?" Ray looked directly into the camera, thinking about Keisha, Marcus, and Tiana. "I would say that the person you love hasn't changed just because their circumstances have changed. They're the same person who worked hard, sacrificed for their family, and built the foundation that allowed you to succeed. They deserve your respect, your support, and your understanding, not your judgment or your pity." The news story aired on a Friday evening in late spring, during the dinner hour when families across Chicago were sitting down together. Ray watched it from his apartment, with Mrs. Washington beside him, offering commentary and encouragement. The piece was 7 minutes long and painted Ray as a community hero who had turned his personal setback into a way to help others. It showed the support group in action, featured interviews with people Ray had helped find jobs, and included testimony from social service workers about the impact of his volunteer efforts. "This man represents the best of what community means," said the director of the Southside Community Center in the story. "He took his own difficult experience and used it to create something positive that's helping dozens of families maintain their dignity during tough times." Ray's phone started ringing before the story was even finished airing. Calls from other community centers asking him to help start similar groups. Calls from displaced workers who had seen the story and wanted to join his support group. And calls from local organizations offering resources and funding for his efforts. But the call that mattered most came on Sunday evening. "Dad, it's Tiana." Ray felt his heart rate quicken. It had been 6 months since he'd spoken to any of his children, 6 months since he'd sent the letters explaining why he was stepping back from their lives. "Hello, Tiana." "Dad, I saw the news story about you. I wanted to call and tell you how proud I am of what you're doing." Ray was quiet, unsure how to respond to this unexpected contact. "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about what happened at Thanksgiving, about the things Keisha said, and the way we all handled the situation. And I've realized that we were wrong, really, really wrong. Tiana, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do, Dad. I need to say this. You were right that day when you defended yourself against Derek's parents. They were being condescending and classist, and we should have supported you instead of being embarrassed by you." Tiana's voice was breaking. "Dad, you're not an embarrassment. You're not a burden." You're the man who raised 3 successful children while working yourself into exhaustion, and we should have been proud to introduce you to anyone." Ray felt tears forming in his eyes. "Baby girl, I appreciate you saying that. Dad, Marcus and I want to meet with you. We want to apologize properly and ask if there's any way we can make things right between us." "What about Keisha?" Tiana was quiet for a moment. "Keisha saw the news story too, but she's having a harder time admitting that she was wrong. She's dealing with some marital problems, and I think the stress of everything is making it difficult for her to face what she said to you." "I see. But Dad, Marcus and I are ready to acknowledge our mistakes and try to rebuild our relationship with you, if you're willing." Ray looked around his small apartment, at the files full of resources for displaced workers, at the thank you notes from people he'd helped, at the life he'd built from the ashes of his relationship with his children. "Tiana, I'm willing to meet with you and Marcus, but I need you to understand something. I'm not the same man I was 6 months ago. I've learned to value myself based on the good I can do in the world, not on whether my family is proud of me." "Dad, we are proud of you. That's what I'm trying to tell you. Watching that news story, seeing the way you've helped so many people, understanding the kind of man you really are, we're ashamed of ourselves for not seeing it sooner." The following Saturday, Ray met Marcus and Tiana at a small restaurant near his neighborhood. Both of his children looked uncomfortable in the modest surroundings, but they also looked genuinely remorseful. "Dad," Marcus began, "I want to start by apologizing for the way I handled things after Thanksgiving. I should have supported you instead of criticizing you for defending your dignity." "Marcus, I appreciate that." "Dad, I've been doing a lot of thinking about the lessons you taught us when we were growing up, about character and integrity and standing up for what's right. Somewhere along the way, I forgot those lessons. I got caught up in trying to fit in with successful people, and I started seeing the world through their eyes instead of remembering the values you taught me." Tiana nodded. "Dad, the work you're doing now, helping displaced workers maintain their dignity and find their way forward, that's exactly the kind of work you taught us to value. You taught us that success means using your opportunities to help others, not using your success to look down on people who are struggling." Ray listened to his children's apologies with a mixture of gratitude and sadness. He was glad they had come to understand their mistakes, but he couldn't forget the pain of being dismissed and rejected by the people he loved most. "I accept your apologies," Ray said carefully, "and I want to rebuild our relationship. But I need you to understand that I won't tolerate being treated as a charity case or a family obligation ever again." "Dad, that's not what we want," Marcus said quickly. "We want to be part of your life because we love you and because we're proud of you, not because we feel obligated to take care of you. And we want you to be part of our lives because you're our father and because you have wisdom and experience that we need," Tiana added. Over the next 2 hours, they talked about the past 6 months, about the changes in all their lives, and about their hopes for rebuilding their relationship. Ray told them about his support group, his volunteer work, and the sense of purpose he'd found in helping others. Marcus and Tiana shared their own struggles with the values they'd learned in their professional environments and their efforts to reconnect with the principles Ray had taught them. "Dad," Tiana said as they prepared to leave, "would you be willing to come to Marcus's apartment next Sunday for dinner? Just the 3 of us. No pressure, no performance required. We want to cook for you and hear more about the work you're doing." Ray considered the invitation. 6 months ago, he would have accepted immediately, desperate for any connection with his children. Now, he had the luxury of choosing based on his own needs and comfort rather than their approval. "I'd like that," he said, "but I want you both to understand that this is a new beginning, not a return to the old relationship." I'm not the same man who was willing to accept disrespect to maintain family peace. We don't want you to be, Marcus said. We want to know the man who built a community support network from nothing, who's helping dozens of families maintain their dignity, who turned his own struggles into a way to help others. As Ray rode the bus home from the restaurant, he reflected on the unexpected journey of the past 6 months. Losing his relationship with his children had been devastating, but it had also forced him to discover his own worth, independent of their approval. The support group, the volunteer work, the news story, all of it had grown from his decision to maintain his dignity rather than accept conditional love. Now his children were asking to be part of his life again, but this time they were coming to him as supplicants rather than judges, asking to learn from him rather than trying to change him. 3 weeks later, Ray received a phone call that surprised him more than the news interview or his children's apologies. "Mr. Williams, this is Dr. Hamilton, Derek's father. I believe we met at Thanksgiving dinner last year." Ray felt his jaw clench at the memory. "I remember you, Dr. Hamilton." "Mr. Williams, I saw the news story about your work with displaced workers, and I wanted to call to apologize for my comments at dinner that day." Ray was speechless. "Mr. Williams, I realize now that my remarks about personal responsibility and individual choices were insensitive and uninformed. Your response that day was completely appropriate, and I should have listened to what you were trying to tell me about the realities facing working people in this economy. Dr. Hamilton, I appreciate you calling. Mr. Williams, I'm involved with a foundation that provides grants to community organizations, and I would like to discuss the possibility of funding for your support group. Would you be willing to meet with me to talk about your needs and goals?" Ray found himself agreeing to meet with the man whose condescending comments had triggered the confrontation that destroyed his relationship with his family. But this time, Dr. Hamilton was coming to him as someone seeking to learn and support his work, rather than someone passing judgment on his circumstances. The meeting took place the following week at the Southside Community Center, where Dr. Hamilton saw Ray's support group in action and met some of the people he had helped. By the end of the evening, Dr. Hamilton had committed to a $50,000 grant that would allow Ray to expand his program to other community centers across the South Side. "Mr. Williams, Dr. Hamilton said as they concluded their meeting, I want you to know that meeting you has changed my understanding of what leadership and community service really look like. You've taken your personal experience and used it to create something that helps others maintain their dignity during difficult times. That's exactly the kind of work our foundation wants to support." As spring turned to summer, Ray's life had transformed in ways he couldn't have imagined a year earlier. The support group had expanded to 3 locations, serving over 150 displaced workers. Ray had been invited to speak at conferences about unemployment and aging, had been featured in a national magazine article about community response to economic displacement, and had been offered a paid position as program coordinator for a new initiative supporting older workers. But the most meaningful change was in his relationship with his children. Marcus and Tiana had become regular volunteers in his support group, using their professional skills to help with job search strategies and benefit applications. They had learned to see their father not as someone who needed to be taken care of, but as someone who was taking care of others. Keisha remained distant, still struggling with her own pride and her marriage problems, but even she had sent a card acknowledging the importance of Ray's work and expressing hope that they could reconcile their relationship eventually. On a warm evening in August, almost a year after the devastating Thanksgiving dinner, Ray stood before a group of 40 people at the Southside Community Center, concluding another successful job search workshop. As the participants gathered their materials and said their goodbyes, Ray felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered, from using his experience to help others navigate their own challenges. "Dad," Tiana said, approaching him as the room emptied, "Marcus and I wanted to ask you something." "What's that, baby girl?" "We wanted to ask if you'd be willing to have Thanksgiving dinner at Marcus's apartment this year. Just the three of us, maybe Mrs. Washington, if she'd like to join us. We want to create new traditions based on gratitude for what we have rather than performance for people we're trying to impress." Ray looked at his children, seeing in their faces the people he had tried to raise them to be: compassionate, authentic, grounded in values that mattered more than social status or professional success. "I'd like that," Ray said, "and I think Mrs. Washington would too." As they walked out of the community center together, Ray reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he had been told by his own daughter that he was nothing but an extra mouth to feed. Tonight, he was surrounded by people who valued his contributions, children who respected his wisdom, and a community that had been strengthened by his efforts. Ray Williams had learned that a man's worth wasn't determined by his employment status, his bank account, or even his family's approval. A man's worth was determined by his character, his contributions to others, and his willingness to maintain his dignity even when the people he loved most couldn't see past his circumstances to the person he really was. The man who had been dismissed as a burden had become a pillar of his community. The father who had been rejected by his children had raised them well enough that they eventually found their way back to the values he had taught them. And the worker who had been discarded by the economy had discovered that his real value lay not in what he could produce for an employer, but in what he could do to help others navigate the challenges he had faced himself. Ray Williams was no longer defined by what he had lost, but by what he had built from the ashes of his former life. And as he walked through the streets of his neighborhood with his children beside him, he felt richer than he had ever felt when he had steady employment and his children's conditional approval. He had found something more valuable than financial security or family acceptance. He had found his own worth, and he had used that knowledge to help others find theirs.